welcome to today's session. Today we continue to take a look at this short story, Balthazar's Marvelous Afternoon. Having taken a closer look at it in the previous session, today we focus on some of the important elements to be discussed. A quick recap before that. Balthazar's Marvelous Afternoon is a short story written by the Colombian writer Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who lived from 1927 till 2014. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1982. Some of his other important works include 100 Years of Solitude, No One Writes to the Colonel, and Love in the Time of Cholera. He is considered as one of the best storytellers of his times, and he also perfected this genre, the subgenre rather, now come to be known as the magic realist form. Balthazar's Marvelous Afternoon is a short story which was originally written in Spanish. We currently access the translation. As you have noted, it has a simple plot. It's a story of a poor carpenter. Apparently, it's very simple, and there's hardly any complexity within the story. But some critics are also of the opinion that this needs to be read as a parable, because Marquez meant this to be read as a story which has some inherent morals, or rather, Marquez trying to convey some value system that he also apparently believed in. The characters in the story include Balthazar, Ursula, Dr. Octavio Giraldo, the Montiels, and the townsfolk. Balthazar comes across as a genius. He makes the most beautiful cage that the townsfolk had ever seen, and there's a lot of demand for the cage that he makes. But Balthazar himself is oblivious to the kind of genius, the kind of craft that he possesses, and he initially treats the cage as an ordinary thing, and only when he begins to garner this kind of an appreciation from the townsfolk, he begins to realize the worth that this piece of work, this piece of art has. He also comes across as a very kind-hearted person, and we get insights about his character throughout his interactions with his wife, with the doctor, with the Montiel family, and so on. It's hard not to notice the biblical allusions in this character right from the name itself. Balthazar is the name of one of the three wise men who traveled to Judea to pay homage to the newborn Jesus. And in between, Ursula, noticing his shabby appearance, because he had been working on this cage for the last 2 weeks, and he had not even shaved. And Ursula says that now he has the look of a Capuchin. That's a reference to a priest. And the occupation that Balthazar pursues in the story, being a carpenter, some have pointed out that there is a direct allusion, a biblical ecclesiastical allusion, where the reference is also to Christ, who was a carpenter. Balthazar comes across as someone who has immense passion for his craft, whether it is in the way that he works or in the work ethics that he displays. We find that being very prominent throughout this short story. Ursula, the woman with whom Balthazar is living, she is a practical minded woman. She comes across as calculative. This is not to say that she is a bad sort of a person, but she comes across as the practical figure in that family, where she fails to see the beauty, the aspect of beauty which is in the cage. On the other hand, she notices the size of it and the price that and the money that this cage could fetch them. She is the one who triggers him, who instigates this desire in Balthazar in the first place to go and ask for 50 or even 60 pesos for the cage. Dr. Octavio Giraldo is the one who perhaps gives the best description of the cage in the short story. He notices not the function of the cage, but describes it as a flight of imagination, and he even goes to the extent of saying that the cage can sing by itself even if there is no bird in it. And this poetic gaze gives the much needed poetical element to this short story by Dr. Octavio Giraldo, pointing out repeatedly that this is perhaps the best artifact that he has ever come across, so much so that he desires it to be gifted to his ailing wife. The Montiels the Jose Montiel, his wife, and the 12-year-old son for whom the cage is being made. They perhaps represent the varied facets of the capitalist outlook. And ironically, much as we dislike the way in which the Montiels behave with Balthasar, especially Montiel and his wife, much as we dislike that kind of a behavior, we also need to acknowledge that the artwork that Balthasar created, it assumes value, it assumes worth only when it is in the possession of the Montiels. And this is perhaps the interesting turning point that Marquez also brings in, Marquez also weaves into this short story. The townsfolk, it's a nameless crowd. We are not being introduced to anyone, any of the individuals in the crowd, but we realize that from the beginning of the story till the end, they play a key role in influencing and determining Balthasar's actions. The readers are also made to realize the worth of this piece of work, this cage, and also the crowd pulling effect of it, only when we are told that there is a crowd outside Balthasar's house to see the cage. And even when Balthasar goes to the Montiels to sell the cage, or rather later he ends up gifting it, even at that time we find this same crowd waiting outside to see the outcome. And this townsfolk, this nameless crowd, it plays a significant role in taking the action forward and also in showing how people can behave in different ways, even out of their nature, when they are asked to perform under immense societal pressure. We find Balthasar being overtaken by an anxiety of performance, in fact, when he goes to the Montiels, not because he really cared for it as an individual, but mostly because there is a crowd waiting outside. And it is also important for Balthasar to assume some dignity and some position, some important position as an artist, especially before the townsfolk. We have already noticed the setting of this short story. There is no particular name given to the town in which this is set, but we get to know that it's a small provincial town where almost everyone seems to know each other, and gossip is a main source of information. It's not as if Balthasar had sent the word out about this new cage which he has finished building. On the other hand, we find a crowd gathering outside, and through them we find the news of the cage reaching far and wide. The physician, Dr. Octavio Giraldo, he apparently reaches Balthasar's house to buy the cage after having heard about it. He himself says the cage looks better than its reputation. It also tells us about the pressure under which Balthasar is placed. Just like the news about the cage had spread far and wide, Balthasar also knows that, and by extension the reader also knows that the news of Balthasar having sold this cage to the Montiels, that will also reach far and wide. That reputation perhaps may take him a long way in terms as an artist, as a carpenter, and more people may approach him because this kind of information, they travel fast, we realize, in that small provincial town by way of gossip. Marquez is a master storyteller, there's no doubt about that, and in Balthasar's Marvelous Afternoon, we find Marquez emerging as a different kind of a storyteller. He makes use of this simple plot, and he makes use of very interesting narrative techniques to convey what he has to say. The narration is apparently, in the surface level, it is very conventional. It's a third person omniscient narrator. We get to know about the action and the thoughts of the characters mostly through dialogues, but there are also comments about characters. We also find the narrator trying to explain the character's feeling and even certain things which are not so obvious to the reader. So here we find that this omniscient narrator is also an intrusive narrator. An intrusive narrator is one who interrupts a story to provide a commentary to the reader. We find this happening at various steps in the short story. If you go back and take a closer look at it again, you will realize that about almost every character there is an insider information that the omniscient narrator, the intrusive narrator, tries to give us. And this also takes the story to a different level altogether, and we begin to wonder whether it's the author, Marquez, he himself trying to manipulate the way in which the story needs to be read. And given that he is indeed a master storyteller, given that he is someone who can experiment with his craft, it is quite possible that Marquez intended the story to be read in a particular way, and he also wanted to place the characters within the molds that he himself had created, so that the reader will not be at a loss to figure out how to evaluate the characters, or rather how to categorize the characters. It comes across as a very conventional, simple plot, but beneath this we can find the layers of expertise of narration. Maybe there are no philosophical truths or profound things that Marquez intends to explore, but the beauty of the story lies primarily in this narration, where we are also able to visualize the pressure that that Balthazar feels throughout the story, and the kind of helplessness and partial sort of a victory that he gains towards the end. Some of the important themes of this short story needs to be taken a look at. We find this obvious theme of greed being positioned vis-a-vis generosity, and both these virtues are placed side by side as contrasting elements, and we also find the characters who are associated with these different qualities. We find Ursula personifying greed at the beginning, but we also find that in some way or the other, Balthazar also toes the same line a little later in the story, especially in that instance where he imagines, where he begins to fantasize about making perhaps 1 million cages and then selling them out to different prospective customers, where he is fantasizing about this mass production that he eventually would be able to do. We find him also being almost greedy, and so Marquez is not trying to present this in black and white. There are also these different shades of there are also these different shades of gray that we would come across, and we find Balthazar embodying generosity more than anyone else, and we also find a generous character, an amicable character in the physician Octavio Giraldo, where he is not resentful of the fact that Balthazar did not sell the cage to him. On the other hand, he immediately forgets that matter, and then he goes on with his life. And towards the end of the story, the idea of greed and generosity, they almost come into conflict with each other, where we are being given an exaggerated account of Montiel's greed, Montiel's stinginess, Montiel's difficulty to part with his money, even if that means owning a piece of art. And on the other hand, we have Balthazar, who is generously gifting this piece of art, this cage, to Pepe Montiel, the 12-year-old boy, because he had already promised him so. And this act of generosity, there is a flip side to it. This act of generosity, this act of benevolence is also an act of revenge at the same time. So, Marquez has successfully brought together different elements, different conflicting emotions within the same character, and within, in some cases, within the same instance or the same episode. The story also asks pertinent questions about the value of art, about whether it's about money or artistic value. And it also ends with this irony about this beautiful piece of art for which people are willing to pay anything. It is gifted, it's not sold. He ends up gifting it partly to please the child, partly to impress the crowd that is waiting outside, and partly as a revenge, as an act of revenge on this rich man Montiel. The story also tells us a little earlier that Balthazar always had a disdain for rich people. So this moment of gifting, this piece of art asks important questions, not just about the value of art, but it also showcases certain elements within Balthasar's character. It also tells us about the ways in which the product is alienated from the producer. And it draws attention to the commercialization of art. Perhaps that's also an important point that Marquez wanted to convey through this short story. The story also raises the issue of society, the societal pressure and the hypocrisy which is inherent in it, the hypocrisy of the townsfolk, or even the hypocrisy of Balthasar himself, who is forced to act and perform in particular ways due to the societal pressure. It also brings in this divide between the rich and the poor, where there are certain expectations and aspirations that the poor have, and on the other hand, the rich also come across as someone who is living within another kind of a hypocritical setup, where they fail to live up to the expectations of the poor, nor do they have this capacity to satisfy themselves. We are also introduced to this immense irony, where the rich man in the town, Jose Montiel, he is unable to fulfill the desire of his 12-year-old son. On the other hand, it is this poor carpenter, this penniless carpenter, Balthasar, who manages to satisfy this desire. This immense irony also shows the differing ways in which Marquez wants us to look at the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots, that it is not always about the wealth that you possess, but it is also about certain other qualities. Class conflict is perhaps an important theme in this short story. It is hard to miss the social status of Balthasar or the different characters who are presented to us. His social status, Balthasar's social status, is linked with his poverty, and this is despite his artistic abilities. While people acknowledge that he is a gifted artist, that this is the best cage in the world, this is the most beautiful cage in the world, that he is a gifted artist, it does not do anything to alleviate the poor conditions in which Balthasar is living. In order to make this piece of art, he had spent 2 weeks, as his partner Ursula points out, which also meant that they did not have any other income the past 2 weeks, when he was focusing not on his routine carpentry job, but on making this cage, which eventually he couldn't even sell. He had to gift it. So it is drawing our attention to the class conflict which is inherent here, where the poor man, the poor carpenter cannot really afford to be an artist unless the piece of art is acknowledged and even bought, at least seemingly, by a rich man. The acknowledgement of his worth as an artist, the acknowledgement of the value, the inherent value of this piece of art, it also lies the power to judge and the power to evaluate. It is also vested with the rich. As we begin to wrap up this discussion, let's also look at some of the questions that the story begins to ask. It forces us to wonder whether the ownership of art is a prerogative of the wealthy, which is what the story also begins to unravel in different ways. And Balthasar's moment of glory, the moment he walks out after gifting this cage to the 12-year-old boy, and the moment when he also decides to lie to the people waiting outside that he managed to sell it for 60 pesos as they all had expected. This is his moment of glory. And this is a moment for celebration, and since we also know more details because of this omniscient narrator, we also find that it's a bit sad, because Balthasar is able to celebrate his moment of glory only when his artwork is bought by a wealthy, powerful person. But Balthasar, the narrator, and the readers know that it was not actually sold, it was only gifted. We also realize that after 2 weeks of hard work, after 2 weeks of neglecting his routine carpentry work, Balthasar is now forced to be penniless. In fact, in a worse condition that he was before. When the story ends, we know that he's drunk, his watch is left as a pawn in the liquor shop, and he's there lying on the street. And the story also tells us that Balthazar had never done this before. And some commentators point out that a whorehouse in that side of the world, or people getting drunk at the end of the day, those are ordinary sights. And for Balthazar to abstain from these kind of things, and for the story to tell us that this is the first time that Balthazar ever did such things, it is of immense significance, because Balthazar's moment of glory is also another low for him. A low for him financially, and a low for him as far as his own value systems and his own personal ethics are concerned. The story also raises questions about the dignity of an artist. Balthazar, who comes across as a dignified soul from the beginning of the story, we find that he is not able to sustain that position when he walks into the Montiel's house. At the Montiels, he is being humiliated, he is being yelled at, and we also realize that his dignity is at stake. Is only by choosing to give this cage to the 12-year-old boy. And that's an act of defiance as far as Balthazar is concerned. And that is one moment through which he reclaims his dignity, and through which he perhaps tries to tell the rich that there are things which they cannot dictate just with the power of money, just with the power of wealth. And when Balthazar walks out, we also realize that his dignity can be maintained or can be elevated when he chooses to lie, and Balthazar does precisely that. The story finally leaves us this important question about Balthazar lying to the people, about the way in which Balthazar as an artist is forced to lie about what he did with his own artwork. And this lie, we do not know how the story proceeds. Maybe this lie cemented his reputation further and he got more orders for his cage, one would never know. Or maybe this lie cemented his reputation as an artist and he continued to live as poor as before. But nevertheless, the important turning point in this story is that moment, the moment of glory which Balthazar seizes by choosing to lie to the crowd which is waiting outside. And as pointed out in the beginning, though the townsfolk, the crowd which gathered in front of Balthazar's house, or the crowd which was waiting outside Montiel's house, and the crowd which got drunk with Balthazar's money, we find that they emerge as equally powerful. Not just Montiel, but this townsfolk, this crowd also emerges as a powerful determinant in assessing the value of this piece of art. I leave you with this short phrase from Plato's work, Ion, where Ion remarks that we are only interpreters of interpreters. Quoting this, one of the commentators of Balthazar's Marvelous Afternoon, he also remarked that at the end of the short story, we realize that there are no final answers, there are no final solutions, because as a reader of Marquez, we are also merely interpreters of an interpreter. With this, we wrap up this discussion on the short story Balthazar's Marvelous Afternoon. I thank you for listening and I look forward to seeing you in the next session.